This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. This is Sunday, October the 14th, 2018, and this is the Prairie Monk Show, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, and the environment, and everything that Dave has been up to this week.
Just to start with, announce a freak show which is in the Lincoln Building, which is very close, and it's sort of organized by Melissa Mitchell, who's been a WEFTie for a long time, and she's got an art studio in the Lincoln Building, and this is a spin-off from it. It's Acme Elfworks, and it puts objects and people in a different location. So it's kind of interesting. This week, I'm going to deal with the Farmer City Trail. I went out there last evening, and it is probably about 30 miles long. It's an abandonment that goes from Bloomington to Farmer City to Mansfield. And from Mansfield into Champaign, the Norfolk Southern Railroad line continues and takes out a lot of grain from the Champaign, Cargill, Anderson's, whatever you want to call it, super elevator. And these days, you take out a huge train. So there's 3-4 lines there that can be loaded, and sometimes they back up to the hill in order to take a long train out. From Mansfield, the trackage has been taken out. It was put in a linear manner. It was taken out in a linear manner. Usually what happens is the bed is cut, the steel is cut at the one end, and then a long train takes its last ride on that track and winds the steel up. The spikes have been basically taken out so that the trackage can lift. It's all stick rail, so it has its joints in it. They do about a quarter of a mile at a time. They have like a ringer on the end of the train, and each track is pulled up onto the train. The train usually has an engine separated from the steel by several dummy trucks, just so that if the train has to stop suddenly, the steel doesn't run through the cab. There's a lot of screeching and noise associated with this, but it's fairly efficient. The train takes that steel to other places where the bolts are cut, and the rail is welded, and that comes back to other places where welded track is needed. That is, if the rail warrants that. This is a main line that used to be Conrail, and it's fairly heavy trackage, but it's a certain dimension that is not awfully universal. So this can't go, for instance, to augment work we're doing with the Railroad Museum because it's not the same cross-section. You can tell when the rail is worn. You take your fingers and put them under the edge and see if it's rolled over. And you can tell if there's cracks or other problems that arise in the steel. Sometimes these tracks are ground to make sure that they are smooth, and this bed has sat in consideration for about 10 years because there's a bridge on that line that was broken down near to Farmer City. There was a move about 10 years ago to make a trail on this corridor, but Norfolk Southern decided to keep it just in case they needed that connection to Bloomington. So they decided otherwise, and the functional group moving and shaking the concept of a trail is in Bloomington. The hope is that in the long run we'll find a way to get through to Champaign. Sometimes that is done by running a trail parallel to the rail on the railroad right-of-way. I'm not very excited about that because my mission in life is to do something about Prairie, and it's the fact that our local ecosystem is on the wane and almost an endangered ecosystem in this area. So to put in a trail with rail is also a challenge for the railroaders because they don't really enjoy having people right next to the rails. That means you have to put up fence lines and work with safety sites like bridges that are separate from the line that is being used. So that means we have to have people who will probably find their way through section roads into Champaign. But this is a connection. It's networking and bringing various communities together through bicycling. It is heavily on the recreational side. The biological side gets second shrift. So I went out to see what was going on, and indeed the tracks have been taken out in a very gentle fashion. The vegetation is up to the edges, and that's relatively neat. There are some piles of ties. What happens when the rail is taken out, then the ties are removed. Usually they're lifted out with a knuckle boom. A knuckle boom truck is one that has a crane on the back and can lift several ties at once and sort them out. There are ties that are designated as relay ties, and the relays go to modern input into rail lines. It takes about 2,000 ties a mile to put a railroad in. We don't have that amount of wood anymore, and besides, concrete ties with some plasticity are getting to be recognized as more effective than wooden ties that do break down, and they're not as uniform as concrete tie that is manufactured over and over. Each tree that makes a wooden tie is different and it responds differently to weight and ballast underneath. So the ties are sorted into piles so that the good ones go to relay, and the second grade ones usually go to landscaping, and then there are the leftover ties that have some creosote in them, and therefore either have to be burned at 360 degrees to break down the phenolic compounds, or they have to be buried 6 feet under so that they don't be a contamination on the landscape. Those latter ties are there at the moment. Some of them are quite adequate to do some rough, tough relaying, which is what we're doing from between Whiteheath and Seymour. So I walked up and down the railroad bed, and I didn't go to Bloomington. I went as far as Harris, which is this side of Farmer City. And I was pleased with the nature of the trail at the moment. I'm not sure how this stick rail was taken out. It may have been with the aid of semi-trailers, or at least the bed at the moment is navigable by semi-trailer or vehicle. So you can inspect it. My concern is the prairie on either side. This is flatland country. The prairie is not pristine. It has been violated a little with the linear input of the railroad bed. But at the time the railroad went in, probably in the 1860s, and since then, drainage on either side of the line to make sure the track doesn't go up and down in bad places. Drainage is important, but drainage also allows invasive trees to come in. So since the line has been vacated for, not used for at least 10 years, the trees have grown sometimes in the railbed itself. So if the Kickapoo Trail is any example, the next maneuver will be to bring in a chipper. This is a chipper for chipping trees into mulch. The ones that usually come in are very heavy duty. They may be 1,000 horsepower with a chipper that's able to take a 6-inch tree and chip it. Mulch can then be sold. It really gets to be a problem with the people who are watching the devastation of the trees, because they love trees, they can hug trees and enjoy. Prairie, as we've always said, it looks like weeds if you don't know what you're doing there. But it's our ecosystem. It's our biochemistry. It's what we may need for a new plant in the future. If we're looking at biodiversity, it may be that's where the microorganisms and the soil is relatively unchemicalized and undisturbed. So this is, for some people who are interested in that sort of thing, a very, very valuable site. It also does not have power lines on it. Many of the railroad lines have an adjacent road and a power line that is on the railroad easement. That power line is subject to being surveilled regularly to remove trees that might short from the ground to the power lines. And some of our grid lines are older and they heat up and they bend down, and so trees are a danger for the electrical grid that we're all in favor of. But in early years, that vegetation was removed by an axe or a chainsaw, and these days we've found herbicide, and that herbicide not only takes a tree out that's alive now, but it sterilizes the soil so that the other trees don't come forth. If you've bought the abandoned railroad bed for its prairie, then this is a very devastating situation. It usually involves Roundup and glycosates, but they're very strong, and they select for grasses, so you end up with a grass prairie. But all the wonderful broadleaf plants, up to probably 110, if you had 10,000 acres of original prairie, you'd probably have at least 100 species of broadleaves, and there's 6 or so grasses. The grasses are welcome to most people because they wave in the wind, and in the fall provide color, and they're a little more exciting than the broadleaves that you often have to look carefully to find. Some few are very prominent, the compass plants and the silphium family, the docks and the rosinweeds, and the cup plants are there, and there are spiderwort and other plants that can survive on a railroad track and survive even with a little creosote. But most of the broadleaves do not survive. So we have potential on the Farmer City Trail, especially between Mahomet and Mansfield, which is active, then from Mansfield to Farmer City, and a little beyond Farmer City. But beyond Farmer City, the line takes a different route and goes through farmland. That doesn't make it any less interesting because the same principles apply. The soil microorganisms, the prairie plants are there on either side, mixed up with invasive trees. If you want to follow this trail, go to your internet and look for the corridor and look for satellite feed. And if you want to get down close, you can enlarge the picture so you can actually see where the invasive trees like autumn olive or the other trees like elms and cherries and ash and have taken on the control. So if you run from Bloomington to Mansfield, you can see this. The trees have arrived because of drainage, because trees like moisture, but they don't like their roots in moisture. And these counties were flat and outwash plains to glaciation and relatively swampy. So they had to be drained, whether it was by farmers creating or augmenting rivers, or for just the railroad and road capacity. It was convenient to run roads adjacent to the railroad lines. The right-of-way is there, and it was simpler to tag onto the railroad line rather than to go through farm fields and create a different corridor. That is the case in this situation. The 150 runs parallel and close to the railroad line. That brings another challenge, and that is the potential widening of 150. And you may not realize it, but it may be in plans for 10 years' time. You have to be able to find the planning paradigms that you would have to find in the Department of Transportation. The Department of Transportation has gotten much more favorably disposed to nature. They realize that between the roads and the railroad lines, there is very little natural area left, and a lot of it is owned by the railroads, which could not be legally invaded for agriculture. And to have the road adjacent to the railroad line was helpful in that at least one side of the road could not be invaded, and there was legal things there that meant that that corridor was a little wider because the two transportation lines were together. I would like to suggest that some of you who are interested in your heritage biology should go to Mahomet and drive 150 and windshield this area just to see what you see. There are little pieces of prairie here and there, but there is the potential for the habitat that used to be. You want to beg biologists not to tidy it up when the trees are gone and plant in the future a spectrum of rough and tough prairie plants, because at the outset this corridor is not a pristine prairie. It has been violated. Some places the trees will change the pH, the acidity of the soil, and so what you have is what we have left. This is a long, skinny corridor that can a predator can work one end to the other and take out the Franklin ground squirrels or other animals that are there. No, it's not ideal. You have farming on either side. Sometimes that farming has herbicide that or pesticide that blow over into the corridor. So it's not the best, it's the only. And so you have to nurture it. And that means you also have to watch it, because we are very interested in what was after 10,000 years of glaciation retreat. So once the glaciers retreated, plants came in from the east or the south, or the mostly from the east and south, a little to the west, but that regrowth succession was slow, and it took 10,000 years. When we look at this corridor, we look at it as a demonstration of what was. We need to know what was in East Central Illinois, and we beg recreators especially to not destroy that nature by planting plants that will look good fairly quickly. We know the public is interested in regrowth succession, that is instant gratification. So we get black-eyed Susans and other plants that grow well in such a corridor. We would hope that that doesn't happen, but I don't have a great deal of hope that it won't happen, because there's always a tendency to make things look good when they don't look good. We're playing with the landscape. So as I walk down the corridor, I'm walking on gravel that is fairly large. It's not too large. It's crushed limestone sometimes. Sometimes it depends on the rock source that you have nearby, because it costs to put down gravel, and it's always better to take that which is local. At Fairmont locally, if we're working with the Kickapoo Trail, we have close proximity of limestone, and that can be used as ballast. So you're walking on ballast. It's ballast that has been compacted so that a square edge will meet with a square edge and be fairly firm and support the heavy weight of a steam engine. That's what was available at the time. And steam engines had very large drive wheels, and they can put a lot of weight on a rail and sometimes destroy it. If it's a stick rail, one end will go down and the other end will be bumped into by the wheel. And that it has always been a problem. That's part of the reason why we have rolled or welded rails. You don't hear a clickety-clack, clickety-clack, clickety-clack of a stick rail anymore. So that went in a linear manner. So you had your steam engine and your rails in front of you, and you had a crane, and you lifted the stick rail 33 feet off, and you put it down on the ties that you already put together. 2,000 wooden ties, 8 feet long, sometimes 5 by 7 inches. It depends on the railroad line what the size of the ties were. The ties are put down about 12 inches apart, 10 inches apart, depends on how much weight you're going to put on. And then you put down the stick rail, bolt it together with ties that are these days rather expensive. If you're going to tie 2 pieces of stick rail together to extend the line, it's going to cost you $100 just for those 2 joiners. So it's a long-term investment. It's also short-term return. So taking out that rail means that you can sell the steel. It's very good steel, and so it's like liquid gold, and likewise the ties. So there's some investment here, and not always has it gone back into the railroads. It's sometimes been a means for other multinationals to use the money that comes from railroad demolition to create or augment a multinational of a quite different style. In the recent years, Railroads have gotten support from Eisenhower era when we put in airports. We subsidized a huge amount of road building, but we didn't do a lot with railroads, and that may or may not be because the railroads like to do their own thing. So in here, there's some politics, and in here is long-range planning. So if you want to know what's going to happen to 150 and if it's going to be widened, then you have to know about that 10 years in advance, and you have to be in Springfield to find out where the planning is. Often the planning is farmed out to other companies, and it is very hard to get a bead on what may or may not happen. And you may even want to go to the point of knowing what is going to be planted on the roadside, because there seems to be barn loads of roadside plants that are rather invasive. The very worst one is one that is used by pollinators a lot because it's sweet clover. There's a yellow and a white sweet clover. And the planting of that on a widened road can actually destroy your prairie. So we're looking at this, and it's very neat, tidy little track that's being used by semis to take out materials. The leftover tires are there. I look at them because some of the leftover tires are almost respectable enough to help us relay between Whiteheath and Seymour in order to get historic trains from the Railroad Museum into Champaign. So I'm looking from a point of view of a biologist and as a railroader. And railroads are important in the format of energy. The standard comment is for a railroad, 1 ton of freight, 1 gallon of gas, and it can be taken 500 miles. You have to realize that there's an infrastructure there, but we're also environmentalists, and that means that freight can be delivered on a main line with much less energy involvement than if you put the same material on the road. If you Solo Cup or Dart, which is replace Solo Cup in summertime when you're producing plastic cups, then 4 railroad cars of plastic would have to be replaced by 13 semi-trailers to take the same material. The semi-trailers would be on roads that are much more subject to damage and repair. The trucks are much less safe. If you have ice on top of a semi-trailer in wintertime, for instance, it can blow off. So this is a safety factor in the railroads too. So we cherish the railroads, we respect the railroads, and so I'm looking at the biology, but I'm also looking at the possible use of some of the leftover tires for re-railing. The next step after removal of the trees is usually to grade the areas. Sometimes the railroad in self-defense has to be on an embankment, so it is higher than the surrounding areas and well drained. Sometimes that section road that goes across the railroad line, you have to drive up and over. that lump. And that can be dangerous because you don't see another car on the other side. So those mounds are taken down so that a bicycle can move gently along, come to a section road, go down to the level of the road that's crossing, and then go up the other side. So there is some modification that goes on. If this railroad line, and I suspect it will be, is part of the Rail Banking Act, then there are rules that go with the rail banking. Just to remind you that with the Rail Banking Act, the railroaders were frightened that they were losing too many rails to abandonment, and decided that if they wanted to buy them back, they were going to have a lot of protest and a lot of costs. If you were going to go through a small town, for instance, the same way as the railroads went through and created small towns, you're going to pay a small fortune in say 200 years' time. So they figured that, or the federal government figured that a Rail Banking Act could allow bicycles, who were bicycle organizations that were buying railroad tracks, to interimly use a railbed, and that railroad would be bought by the locals, but if something happened that corridor was needed in the future, it could be returned to railroads. But railroads would have to buy it back, but they would have it secure. That's what's going on with the Kickapoo Trail, and the input from the federal government for enhancing that trail as a potential rail corridor, or as an immediately a bicycle trail. Then there was $12 million from that source. That $12 million has encouraged state money and local money. And so there's kept being grants for toilets or seating accommodation or other advantages, information details, like this is a river and this is why the railroad is going across at this node. So it is a lot of money involved, but it reads common sense. And so I'm looking at the ballast, and where I was, it was not very much higher than the surrounding territory. So the Prairie comes up to the ballast. And the interesting thing about Prairie is that once the ballast is vacated and the line is still sitting there, the real estate is sitting there, the plants come up, and the plants that grow on the railroad right-of-way are more adapted to dryness. And so it creates a different spectrum, a different habitat. And so that is interesting too. The next step in railroad development is according to an ASTO. ASTO is the Association of Highway Engineers and Transportation Engineers, and they are sort of the gurus that suggest one-size-fits-all railroad bed. The width of this railroad bed is usually 12 feet wide, and it involves protection of the ground. The first thing to happen is that once it has been planed out and organized for a trail, the ties are out, but the creosote may still be there. So in order to ensure that the human bodies do not encounter the creosote, which it maybe have been leached a lot over 100 years or more that the railroad has been there, the creosote is capped. I'm not quite sure what the amount of capping is, but it's probably about 6 inches of gravel that is finer than the ballast that's underneath. And then, just in case the creosote goes down on either side, that ballast is then mown and manicured alongside the trail. So eventually you have a very wide trail with embankments or areas into the prairie that are destroyed. Once that ballast is and the embankments are capped, then a fine-grained crushed limestone is put down, which is an all-weather trail. But what is left for the prairie depends on whether you widen the road and whether you treat the sides or the batters, which is sometimes what they're called, with capping. So in order to do this, the trees have to be removed, which is always very controversial. And there are a few trees are left to provide some ambiance. But basically, if you destroy all your prairie, then you're looking at cornfields, and we can do that from the road. So if you're wanting to walk this corridor, hike and bike, it's nice to have some of the native vegetation. And sure, that can be replaced by planting, and the roadsides can be planted to roadside species, including the invasives that we are very worried about. And that has happened in the area between Urbana and Mayview. This is an area where the university, nabobs, Vestal and Stafford, I'm forgetting the next name, and then Kendi used to rent that area before they had a biological union, an ecological union, started by a fellow named Coles who worked on the Michigan dunes, and his daughter, May Watts, who initiated a book, Reading the Landscape, that is very famous for looking at the landscape for its nature. That area, the Ecological Union found had a student named George Feld, and George Feld went off to Washington with the blessing of his mentors and formed the Nature Conservancy. So here was not only prairie, but here was the history of a major Nature Conservancy, and now it's gone. And I don't want to see that happen further west or further east. If this width of trail continues through Bronson and Oakwood, then a rather famous little prairie that was used for seed collection by Doris Westfield to create a prairie in Vermilion County Conservation District will be totally decimated. How do we work with this? How do we find the plans for the Farmer City Trail? How do we work with the political people. They're farmers who don't enjoy the weeds, the potential prairie. There are the roadsides that want to widen it, and there are the recreators who want to travel on it in a recreational style, not always realizing the value of this corridor as for nature. Well, I was thinking we should make an announcement. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, and they're my opinions, but I think they're very real, and I would like you to be out there to see the structure of this corridor, the nature of the road that's there. This road is paralleled by Route 74 that goes all the way through to Galesburg, and it bypasses Bloomington. But you can get on this old 150, and it's still used by a lot of traffic, but it's not nearly as well used as in the days when you had to drive to Bloomington, and you may have had 30 crashes per year because people were tempted to pass a semi on a very narrow road. This is a 2-lane road, but it can also be widened if you're in that mood. If expansion of villages and cities gets to demand it, then that will be very tempting to go in and take out some of the last prairie. You can't see the prairie plants at this time of the year because they've gone into their fall dormancy. The roots are there. Some of us who are used to recognizing the plants in their fall state know where there are the small elements of remnant prairie. But it's not easy to check. But I applaud those groups that make this knowledge possible. We have a natural areas study group which meets once a month and goes to a site, and very informally they are a docent group. A docent group is a group that educates themselves about the quality and interesting aspects of a natural area, and they may or may not have a leader that's available. The leadership can be provided by other groups like the Grand Prairie Friends or the Natural History Survey, the organizations like the Audubon Society of the Sierra Club, and for years we had a reading the landscape course at Parkland, which took people to places. But David is involved with a Master Naturalist program, and it demonstrates some of the things I want to encourage. So I want him to say something about the Master Naturalist program, which is coming to the end of its theoretical thing, but then there's a practical
That's
side.
right. The book learning is almost over. Yes, we're down to the last 3 Tuesdays of sitting in classrooms and being told things, and then occasionally getting to go out into the field and actually, for example, go into the Middle Fork and pick up some small aquatic animals and see the actual living things that we've been talking about in our classes. It's been really, really, really fun. On one hand, it's amazing how little there is. You're going to learn about herpetology. You're going to learn about botany. You've got 3 hours and someone's going to come in and explain the whole subject of Illinois' natural botany and forest, things like that. And they've got 3 hours in which to do it. But if you're going to learn about the weather and climate of Illinois, wouldn't you like to be taught the subject, given the most cursory veneer of coverage of it from Jim Angel, the state climatologist of the state of Illinois. Oh my gosh! It was spectacular to get to listen to this man for 3 hours because some of the details were just amazing, and there's the amazing things to take away from this class. He showed us on one slide, if you want to see the most concentrated cornfields in the United States, they start around central Illinois and they kind of go northwest to up at least as far as Minnesota. I said, well, we've also noticed that it doesn't get as cold at night in the summer times and into the fall. Let's take a look and see where that is. Starts in central Illinois and goes northwest to Minnesota. This is only a correlation, he says, but it's just amazing to see. This is only weather change. This is not climate. But this is the sort of stuff that you can get from this class. We have a geology class we haven't even gotten to yet. And the person who wrote the chapter is a fellow named Dwayne Berggren, who I worked with 2 decades ago at the Geological Survey. The number of things you could learn from talking to this man. And I'm going to get to read the chapter that he wrote about the geology of Illinois. So, but yes, everything in this class, it's 12 class periods that are most of a work day, like 7 hours of learning things. And at the end of it, you're not a master naturalist. You've got lots of work to do. I was actually talking with somebody. There's a comparable class called the Master Gardener class. And there is one fundamental difference between them. In both cases, you're expected to learn quite a bit about the subject, but specifically in Master Naturalists, you're going to be a volunteer. To maintain your status as one of these people, you've got to put in, to become one in the first place, 60 hours of volunteer work. And once you've made it that far, every year after that, you need to put in an additional 30 hours of volunteer work. So it doesn't really matter that I'm not going to know everything. I'm taking the class partly because Liz, who is a Master Naturalist, has joined Dave and I in some of these places. And when Dave talks about prairies, she knows what he's talking about. And I'm just kind of wearing a beanie cap, kind of saying, oh, is that New Jersey tea? No, Dave, that's quinine. Oh, okay, it looks a little bit the same. I'll just have to learn this. So taking this class, I'm learning a little bit about the natural world that's out there, and then I'll have 60 hours of volunteer work to go out and start reinforcing
Do you have an assignment?
Not yet. I'll tell you what, the work that I do with you, not being on the air here, but when you and I work on the computers to create videos, that can count as part of my 60 hours toward the volunteer work. But I would never claim that should be the entire... I want to do something else besides sit at a computer. That's one reason why I'm doing all of this stuff with nature, is to not be computer bound like this. So I'll be working with you with doing some prairie things, and every week there are several things. They're doing seed picking, and they're pulling out honeysuckle, you'll be happy to know, and so will Liz. And they just announced that next weekend they're going to go back.
You're also working with the Children's Science Museum, and some of this spills over into that situation. And Dale Berggren has done this for years and years.
I can imagine. He's retired now. Mm-hmm. The last Friday of this month, at the 4-H something or other at Allerton,
yes,
they're going to have a retreat for us Master Naturalists. And 2 of the classes that I'm going to take involve teaching. One of them is, how do you find the resources to teach about nature to people in general. And one of the classes, I think these are about an hour and a half each, will be specifically, how do you teach nature to children? One of the great things about being at the Orpheum Children's Science Museum, it's for children, but it's about science. And you walk through the museum and you see children that are fascinated by something. And in an uneducated way, I have no education background. I know the science behind all of these things. How do you explain to children of various ages the principles of the science, the most basic pieces of what it is that they're looking at? And sometimes the children are so small, they're toddlers, they're just watching water come off of a table and into a tray that just refeeds the water back. You don't even try to teach them. Isn't it pretty? Doesn't it sound nice? But as they get older, if they're spinning around on something, you explain you're doing the same thing that figure skaters do. And you can learn the science, the physics behind why figure skaters slow down and speed up depending on their posture while they're spinning. So that these things in this class, one way or another, I'm going to find a way to use them for teaching somehow.
So the museum actually has a little prairie that people can go out to.
Yes, if you see along the roadways, along streets in town, they have little pollinator plots. Yes. We at the museum have several of those too. And in fact, Dave was very kind to come one afternoon when we had a class on it at the museum to help talk with Xander at our end about the different types of plants that we've got that are prairie plants and the different sorts of butterflies in particular, but that's not all butterflies. If you see a bug on a plant, it may well be a pollinator that's picking something up, and it will eventually make its way to another plant and leave pollen there. And so even flies can be pollinators.
Yes.
Mosquitoes.
Look at the time.
We're down to 3 minutes. Thank you for giving me 5+ minutes to.
Well, that is tremendously valuable.
Shotgun that, yes.
And beyond what you're talking about is the politics. Dwayne has been involved at the county level to move and shake some of these thoughts, and there are others that we really appreciate who know the need for the genetics, the gene pool, the future biochemicals, the microorganisms that are in the soil. We know very little about these creatures, and some of them are going to be our future. So if we destroy all this, we don't have it. But it's not only us, we that will miss it. It'll be people around the world. When there was no soybeans, agronomists went around the world to find plants, glycine plants, that may have been tiny in a desert or tall, but they're brought back. So the University of Illinois has a huge collection of those plants that they constantly breed to improve the annual soybean, which erodes. But if you want a perennial soybean that you mow for 20 years, then you're going to have to get the bacteria, the plant that might be Illinois bundleweed, to work.
Well, I'm afraid you're down to just over a minute here.
So okay. Please think about taking a drive to Mahomet and then on to Mansfield and on to Farmer City and see what you think about your heritage prairie. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial, and thanks for listening. And it's
Dave on the board.